March 1944. The distant sound of cannons echoed through the hills of Italy. In the midst of thick smoke rising from bombed villages, between mud-covered ambulances and wounded soldiers moaning on improvised stretchers, walked a woman with firm steps and a determined gaze. She wore a simple nurse's uniform, stained with blood and dust, but no one there knew the truth. She was not a doctor. She had no hospital training. She was a journalist. Her name was Martha Gellhorn, one of the first women to cover a war with her own eyes, not through the filtered words of official communiques or the sanitized reports that reached newsrooms. Martha was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1908. She grew up in a progressive family where her mother was an activist for women's rights. From a young age, Martha knew she didn't want a conventional life. She wanted to write. She wanted to witness history. And above all, she wanted to tell the stories that no one else was willing to tell. In the 1930s, she covered the Great Depression in the United States, traveling through the country's interior and documenting the misery the government tried to hide. Her reports were raw, honest, disturbing. She was not afraid to show the truth, even when that truth was ugly. When the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, Martha went to Spain. It was there that she saw, for the first time, the true face of war. Not the romanticized heroism of movies, but real terror. Children dead under rubble, violated women, entire villages erased from the map. And it was there that she met Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway, at the time, was already one of the most famous writers in the world. He was also covering the war. They fell in love amid the chaos. They married in 1940. But the marriage was turbulent from the start. Hemingway wanted a wife who would stay home. Martha wanted to be at the front. Now, in 1944, while Hemingway covered the war officially, with credentials, military escort, and privileged access, Martha was left out. The army didn't give credentials to women. The doors were closed. But Martha was not the kind of person who accepted closed doors. While men wrote reports in safe rooms, far from danger, Martha infiltrated the battlefields. She believed that the truth was not in the carefully worded headlines, but in the smoking ruins, the open wounds, the faces that no one wanted to show. But to see that truth, she would need to break all the rules and risk everything she had, her reputation, her freedom, and perhaps her life. In London, that same month of March, the Allied military command was preparing the offensive that would change the course of the war. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, was near. Everyone knew something big was coming, but the details were kept in absolute secrecy. Hundreds of journalists requested permission to cover the invasion. Among them, Ernest Hemingway. He received official credentials. He would have access to warships, commanders, military operations. Martha also requested credentials. The response was quick and dry. The front is no place for ladies. She read that sentence and felt the anger rise in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd heard this. It wouldn't be the last. But this time, she wasn't going to accept it. Martha tried everything. She wrote letters, made appeals, used her contacts in the press. Nothing worked. The British and American armies were inflexible. Women would not go to the front. Period. Hemingway, knowing her frustration, was condescending. "Martha, you can cover the hospitals here in London. That's also important." She looked at him with contempt. "I didn't come all this way to write about bandages."
The tension between them grew every day. Hemingway wanted glory. Martha wanted truth. And there was an enormous difference between the two. That's when Martha had an idea.
If she couldn't enter as a journalist, perhaps she could enter another way. She discovered that hospital ships were recruiting volunteer nurses to care for the wounded who would arrive from the battles in Italy. They didn't require press credentials, just a willingness to help. Martha signed up. She forged some documents, used a borrowed badge from a nurse she knew, and on a cold March morning, she clandestinely boarded a British hospital ship departing for the Mediterranean. She carried only a small suitcase with basic clothes, a Leica camera hidden at the bottom of her luggage, some film rolls sewn into the lining of her coat, and a notebook she kept close to her body. While officials made lists and censored images before they were even taken, Martha prepared her own list. The names, the faces, the voices that war tried to erase. She knew that if discovered, she would be deported immediately, perhaps imprisoned, perhaps never able to work as a journalist again. But she would continue, because for her, telling the truth was more important than obeying orders. That first night, the ship crossed the Mediterranean in tense silence. The sea was calm, too calm, but the air was heavy, loaded with fear. Martha shared a small cabin with 3 real nurses. They didn't suspect her. After all, why would they? She wore the uniform correctly, knew the basics about bandages and wounds, and seemed genuinely willing to help. And she was willing. Because Martha understood something that many journalists of the time didn't understand. To truly tell a story, you needed to be inside it. You needed to smell the blood, hear the screams, touch the trembling hands of the dying. At night, when the other nurses slept exhausted, Martha went down to the lower deck, where wounded soldiers were kept on lined-up stretchers. The lighting was dim, just lanterns swaying with the ship's movement. Wounded soldiers moaned on improvised stretchers. Some called out their mothers' names, others cried in silence. There were boys of 18, 19 years old, really boys, with amputated arms, faces disfigured by shrapnel, empty eyes that had already seen too much. Martha, with the camera hidden under her smock, recorded everything discreetly. She didn't use flash. She couldn't risk drawing attention. She worked only with the light from the lanterns, manually adjusting the lens aperture, breathing slowly to avoid shaking. With each silent click, a small portion of the truth was saved. A gaze lost in the void, a hand trembling while holding a letter from home, a tear rolling down the dirty face of a soldier who knew he would never walk again. These were the images that no one would see in the newspapers. They were images that contradicted the optimistic headlines about glorious advances and heroic victories. Among the wounded, Martha found a young American soldier named James. He was 20 years old. He had lost both legs in an explosion near Casino. "They said I was a hero," he murmured, looking at the ship's ceiling. "But I just wanted to go home." Martha held his hand. "You are much more than what they said you were." She spent hours talking with the soldiers, writing down their names, their stories, the names of the people they loved. She knew many of them wouldn't survive, and if she didn't record those stories, they would disappear forever. Each invisible flash, each quick note in the notebook was a silent resistance against forgetting. She knew that if discovered, all of that would be confiscated, but she continued, because for her, telling the truth was more important than her own safety.
When the ship arrived at Anzio, on the Italian coast, the scene was indescribable. Anzio was surrounded. The Allies had landed there in January, expecting a quick advance toward Rome, but the Germans counterattacked with brutal violence. Now, months later, Allied soldiers were trapped on a narrow strip of land, constantly bombarded. The sky was covered with black smoke. The ground shook with each explosion. It was impossible to distinguish where the shots came from the front, the sides, or behind. Bodies were carried in lines, covered by improvised blankets. Field hospitals were overcrowded, with wounded scattered on the floor, between stretchers. Doctors operated non-stop, covered in blood, their eyes red from exhaustion.
Martha disembarked with the other nurses, but while they ran to help in the hospitals, Martha stayed behind, observing. She saw mutilated soldiers waiting for treatment in lines that didn't move. She saw Italian civilians, women, children, elderly, trying to flee the bombings, carrying bundles with the little they could save. An Italian girl, no more than 7 years old, was sitting alone amid the rubble. She held a dirty doll, missing an arm. She stared blankly into space. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared. Martha approached, knelt beside the girl, and took a photo. That image, the silent girl, the broken doll, the chaos in the background, would become one of the most powerful war photos ever taken. But at that moment, no one but Martha knew it existed. She continued walking through the ruins. She photographed soldiers sleeping in ditches, too exhausted to seek shelter. She photographed doctors amputating limbs without anesthesia because supplies had run out. She photographed Italian women digging holes in the hard earth to bury their dead. Martha didn't keep the camera hidden. She raised it. Each click was a silent accusation. The photos showed something no military propaganda showed: the real pain of soldiers, the absolute despair of civilians, the unpayable price of war. But not everyone saw that as courage. For some, it was treason. One morning, after 3 days in Anzio, Martha was at the field hospital, helping change bandages. She had hidden the camera inside a box of medical supplies. The film rolls were sewn into the uniform's lining. That's when a British officer approached. He observed her for a long moment. He noticed how she looked around, not like a nurse, but like someone who was memorizing every detail. "You photograph too much for a nurse," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly who you are, Miss Gellhorn. We found your name on the list of journalists who were denied access to the front." Martha was taken for interrogation in an improvised tent. 2 officers were waiting for her. They asked who had authorized her to enter. They asked how many photos she had taken. They asked if she was working for any specific newspaper. Martha faced them without fear. "No one authorized me. I came because someone needed to show the truth, and truth doesn't need permission." The officers were not impressed. The camera was seized, the film rolls confiscated. Martha was locked in a small, dark room with guards at the door. They said she would be deported back to London on the next available ship. But what the officers didn't know was that Martha had been careful. Some of the most important film rolls she had secretly sent to London, hidden in personal letters that wounded soldiers carried back home. And in a few days, those photos would shock the world. Back in London, newspapers received Martha's images with caution. Some editors refused to publish, fearing military retaliation. Others hesitated, saying the photos were too sensationalist or harmful to troop morale. But a small, independent newspaper, the Picture Post, decided to publish. The edition came out with a simple but devastating headline: "The War They Don't Want You to See." The photos showed exhausted soldiers sleeping in open ditches, their faces covered in mud and blood. They showed orphaned children waiting in endless food lines, their eyes empty of hope. They showed Italian women digging holes in the hard earth to bury their dead, their hands raw. It was war without makeup, war without propaganda. Real war. The reaction was immediate and explosive. In Washington and London, military officials were furious. They said those photos weakened troop morale, that they gave ammunition to the enemy, that they didn't show the complete picture. But for those who saw the photos, one thing became clear. Heroism was not in the pompous speeches of generals. It was in those who survived, day after day, the indescribable hell of war. Letters began arriving at newsrooms. Mothers of soldiers wrote thanking Martha for showing what their sons were really facing. Veterans wrote, saying that for the first time, someone had told the truth about what they had lived through. But there was also fierce criticism. Conservative politicians accused Martha of being unpatriotic. Some called her a traitor. They said she was staining the honor of soldiers. Martha responded in an article published days later, "I do not stain anyone's honor. War stains. I merely show." Shortly after publication, but there was also fierce criticism. Conservative politicians accused Martha of being unpatriotic. Some called her a traitor. They said she was staining the honor of soldiers. Martha responded in an article published days later, "I do not stain anyone's honor. War stains. I merely show." Shortly after publication, Martha was officially banned from battlefronts. Her name entered military blacklists. No Allied command would give her credentials. She was marked as undisciplined, dangerous, and unreliable. For months, she lived on the margins of newsrooms. Many newspapers didn't want to publish her work, fearing reprisals. She ran out of money, without access, without an official voice. But Martha didn't fall silent. She continued writing, denouncing, photographing, now completely independently. She published in small newspapers, in alternative magazines, in bulletins that circulated hand to hand. She wrote a powerful essay called "War Belongs to the Men Who Make It, Not Those Who Die in It," where she said, "War is the failure of men who believe too much in themselves and too little in the people who die for them. Generals speak of strategy. I speak of bodies. They speak of victory. I speak of widows." Her reports began circulating independently, copied and secretly sent among journalists, writers, and activists. She no longer had credentials, but she had something the army could never confiscate: the courage to look. Meanwhile, her marriage to Hemingway completely crumbled. He, covered in official glory, received awards and praise for his war coverage. She, banned and censored, struggled to keep her voice alive. Hemingway didn't understand why she kept insisting. "You've done your part, Martha. Why don't you stop?" She looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt, because stopping would be lying. They separated in 1945. Hemingway never forgave her for choosing truth over him. When the war ended, Martha returned to destroyed Europe. She walked through the streets of Berlin in ruins, where historic buildings had been reduced to concrete skeletons. She talked with German widows searching for their husbands' bodies among the rubble. She talked with orphans living in dark basements, surviving on food scraps. She visited the newly liberated concentration camps. She saw the piles of bodies, the ovens still warm, the survivors who weighed less than 90 pounds. And she wrote about all of it, not with anger, but with a deep sadness and an unwavering determination that this would never be forgotten. Martha realized that truth, even when silenced, always finds a way to reappear. The photos the army had tried to confiscate reappeared years later in forgotten archives, in museum basements. Decades later, her photos, previously censored, began to be exhibited in galleries, museums, and history books. The same images that generals tried to hide were now studied as essential historical documents. Martha Gellhorn lived until 1998, at the age of 89. During her life, she covered 6 wars: Spain, Finland, China, World War II, Vietnam, and Central America. She wrote dozens of books, hundreds of articles, and inspired entire generations of reporters. But what is most impressive is not what she wrote, it's what she dared to see. Today, when we look at her photos, we don't just see war. We see the price of truth, the cost of being a woman in a world that tried to silence female voices. She proved that a camera can be as powerful as a weapon, and that the courage to face horror head-on is the first step to defeating it. She didn't seek glory, nor headlines. She sought only to show what others pretended not to see. And for that, she became something no censorship could erase: the witness of truth.